him saying, "Thank you for the service." What he was saying is they'd just taken a service for his wife, a funeral. And I think they said some good things about her, remembered who she was. I think also there was a sense of consolation, that is to say, a sense in which she still was existing in the heavenly kingdom with God. He felt that whatever I had said, whatever had happened in that service, it had gone well. And then he said to me, "If only you were not tall, church, we'd come and see you every week." And it took me a while to realise what he was saying when he said tall church. What he meant, any guesses? Higher church, absolutely right. Didn't know really what he was talking about. I'm not sure if he really realised what the difference between high church and low church was. What he was saying is, you're there when we need you, but otherwise we are not going to come. We are not going to be bothered. And we'll use that as an excuse. Too high, too low, it doesn't fit with our lifestyle. We're not going to make that choice. It's interesting, isn't it? Because people do that sort of thing all the time. They talk about the real world. We have to live in the real world. But interestingly enough, the real world is a very movable feast, depending on what people want to say about themselves, what they want to take part in, the way they wish to see their society, their particular group of friends. It's a very movable feast indeed. I remember when I was at a grand dinner in Oxford, I sat next to someone who spent most of their life in the university, a very learned man. And I was young and naive in those days, and I said to him, "What do you say when people ask you, do you live in the real world?" And he looked at me and smiled and said, "People ask me that all the time." And the reply is, "I live in the more real world." And I wondered what he meant by the more real world. And I suppose what he was saying is, when we look at the way we live today, when we look at the people that we mix with, when we look at the turmoil that our society and our world very often appears to be in, we face huge troubles, we face huge disappointments. Is that our real world, or is that the less real world? What he was saying is, he lives in a world where there are ideals which we reach for. And if those ideals actually were ever gained, then that real world would be a beautiful place, a sublime place, a place in which we would all want to exist quite happily. Trouble is that we don't always reach those ideals. We very often find ourselves and the people around us falling short. I suppose it's part of the human condition. Nevertheless, it's a question we find ourselves asking so much of the time. What is the real world? What is my real world in which I want to exist? Is it a world of ideals, or is it a world of here and now? And that answer can take many different forms. What is the real world for you today, here and now? Is the real world simply physicality? That is to say, I am here, I have a body, I therefore exist, and anything that touches me or anything that I can touch is therefore the real world. Well, that's a rather naive way of looking at the real world. And I'll give you two examples of why it's a naive way of looking at the real world. The real world is far more than physicality. When you walk into a room, you know if somebody's upset or they're not talking to you because there's something far more beyond the physical which reaches out and touches you. It's about soul and emotion, far more than just the corporal world. And also, if you think about it, this corporal world in which we exist, is this the acme of existence? An older, larger man standing in front of you? Well, I suspect it is not the best that I can offer. But here it is. It is a version of the real world. A very different version from 20 years ago. And I suspect, whatever happens to me, a very different version from 20 years to come. If that's the real world, then it doesn't really give us a basis for actually thinking about how we should exist or what we should do. It simply is the here and now. Well, what else could the real world be? Is it a world of actually understand the world in which we live. And yet most of those scientific theories are just that, theories. They're hypotheses based on hypotheses, and they don't always work. A couple of examples. Remember the bumblebee that's not aerodynamically sound, and yet it's able to fly? Remember that little beetle thing that squirts acid and water and comes out to kill its neighbours? How does that happen by accident if we follow this idea of evolution? We blindly accept so often scientific theories which don't always make sense. They can produce guidelines. They can produce an understanding, but they are not the real world in essence which we have to submit to. They're merely a version of the real world. And what about that real world that we have, where we talk about what's good and bad and everything else? It seems to me that that's just as fluid. Is the real world actually bound by economics? Is the real world bound by what I can achieve for myself at the expense of others? Is that really the real world today? Well, so many people seem to think it is the real world. The real world is about what I can get away with. It exists to those I want to socialise with, and those who happen to be my family, and those I love. And beyond that, nothing else matters. As one woman said to me in Cape Town once, I can't think about the poor, and I can't think about the starving. It's enough that I just have to get on and look after myself. Is that the real world that we want? Are those the sorts of thoughts that we should have which guide us and help us to make our decisions in life? I wonder if that's the real world. Well, Christ offers another real world. I remember somebody writing in the newspaper when we were talking about putting our sermons on YouTube. And somebody said, he's actually expounding Iron Age, Bronze Age thoughts in a technical, up-to-date media. Shame on him. Interesting though, isn't it? That there's something there that says we have a truth that has existed for a very long time. An essence of truth which people have used to guide our lives over such a very long time. But in actual fact, longevity is not the key to what I'm talking about. Even war has a wonderful scene, a battle scene, where people are slaughtered, and after the battle, an ancient tribe comes out and picks the remnants and robs the dead. One of the older civilizations in our world. And he begs the question, is longevity actually the key to reality? And he answers his own question by saying, look what longevity sometimes gives us, grave robbers. It's not just about being old, it's about that central truth. We have several central truths, and they're summed up in two great sayings. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. What that says to us quite simply is, besides all other truths and realities, this world, this universe, our very selves were all created by a God who had a purpose for us and loves us and wants us to be all that we can be. It's a central truth of our faith. And that has implications. If God loves me and loves everyone in this room, then we should be respecting each other and working together to build a better world. A world in which we can exist and coexist in a way that enjoys and allows us to be the best that we can be. To be at peace with one another, to be at peace with ourselves, to be at peace with God. Loving our neighbours as ourselves. It's an interesting one, isn't it? That's the one that's so hard, because with God we can say this is God, that's God. With our neighbours, it actually means looking at the person sitting next to you. It means looking at the person as you walk down the road. It means reading the newspapers and saying, I want to make a difference, because this world is not as it should be. And the only way we can make a difference is when we act. Not someone else, not government, not anything else. It's when we act and put our faith into reality. There's that other great saying, isn't there? That freedom of choice is the guide to our democracy, is the guideline to our existence and reality. It always makes me laugh when we talk about freedom of choice, because we've been talking about it for centuries. St. Anselm had something very interesting to say about freedom of choice. He said that there is no real freedom of choice at all. What he said is, you can discern a right from a wrong. But every time you do something which you know to be wrong, it isn't freedom. Because you're saddling yourself with something that you know that's wrong. You're belittling your lives. You're taking something and making it your master when it shouldn't be your master. That is not freedom of choice. That is slavery to sin. That is slavery to wrongdoing. That is slavery to some other suggestion. Every time we say to ourselves, I am going to be better than this person by treading on them. I am going to look after myself because I can't be bothered to go out and help someone. That is slavery to laziness and self-centeredness. That is not freedom. True freedom is when you can sit at home and say to yourselves, I have had the choice, but the only real choice was to do the right thing and the good thing. The only real choice was to do something which gave me peace of mind, because I know that I have peace with my neighbour and there's nothing left undone that could be done. And peace with my God, because I recognise my God. It's interesting, isn't it? We come back to these ideas of the real world. What is the real world for us? The world of Christ that we're trying to build? And what is freedom of choice? Is it the freedom to go off and do what we like and do wrong things? Or is it the freedom to recognise that we can actually build this world and work to it? The choice is ours. And that's what was being said in the readings this morning. Are we going out into our faith and saying, we don't want it because it's too elaborate, or we don't want it because it's not elaborate enough? Or are we saying, what are the central truths that God, through Jesus Christ, wishes to teach us? And if we know those truths, are we inclining our lives and are we making it a reality? Choice, as always, is ours. Amen.